I'm Rob Moore.
And I'm Lee Moore.
This is the Chinese Literature Podcast.
What are we looking at today, Rob?
We're going back to our roots, Lee. The one we're looking at today, this was actually the very first podcast we ever did.
I remember that. It was
like yesterday.
It was a dark and stormy afternoon in Eugene sometime in the beginning of spring quarter 2015.
So long ago.
Yeah.
You brought a growler of something, and I think by the time we finished it, the podcast was a lot less coherent than the beginning.
But a lot better, if I remember correctly.
It is possible.
Less coherent, though.
Although, I'll say, it's kind of a good thing that this has been lost to the sands of time.
We have no record of it as far as we know, right?
There is no record that it ever existed except the fact that we're talking about it. It was pretty bad.
It was very bad.
It was literally the first podcast we'd ever done. So.
We did it at your apartment, right?
Yeah, it was pretty rough.
So, enough of nostalgia. What are we actually looking at?
We're talking about an essay called People's Literature by Zhou Zuoren, who was Lu Xun's brother.
Wait a second. Lu Xun and Zhou Zuoren are brothers? How come they don't have the same last name?
I'm glad you asked that very impromptu question, Lee, that we clearly did not talk about beforehand. Lu Xun is a pen name. Lu Xun's real name was Zhou Shuren.
Oh, his real name is Zhou Shuren.
Zhou Shuren.
Okay.
Zhou Shuren and Zhou Zuoren were brothers. So, they came about at roughly the same period. Lu Xun went on to become way more famous.
Yes.
Although Zhou Zuoren in his early career was very influential in the way literature was formed in China.
He wrote a lot of what's called sanwen, or essays.
Yeah.
And he, at his time, I think he was not really that much less famous than Lu Xun.
No, for a while. But they diverge because, and I'd love to do some sort of class or just have someone write a book on this at some point. But to a very great extent, the two together kind of model two twin concerns or interests in early modern China.
Fraternal threads of Chinese literature, if you will.
What a great title, man. Zhou Zuoren was very much, he was a student, he was a scholar. He said once that he felt like he'd been born in the wrong era. He would have done way better in an earlier era when he could just focus on his studies and not always have to write about politics and things. And
I know how that feels.
I know. Well, all you do is write about politics. Lee's the political guy in the room. But Zhou Zuoren wrote about tea. He wrote about classical poetry and also wrote about Western imperialism and
Western history. Lots of stuff. He was a man of varied interest.
Yeah, and translated and did lots of things. So, but what's interesting to know about him, before we start talking about his essay, is that he was persona non grata in China for decades. Like, he was not studied, written about until, I think, really even the mid-90s.
He was accused of collaborating with Wang Jingwei's government in Shanghai that was working with the Japanese. And because of that, he essentially, like you said, was persona non grata.
Yeah, and for a very long time. This was the sort of thing, even being accused of collaborating with the Japanese was definitely enough to get you blackballed. And I worked with a professor when I was in Tianjin who wrote a lot about Zhou Zuoren. That was his focus. And he was mentioning that's still kind of a new field. There's not if you look at the article database in China, there's a lot of articles now about Zhou Zuoren, but those have all been written in the last 20-something years, 30 years.
Okay.
Whereas people have been writing about Lu Xun since Lu Xun has been writing.
Right.
And yet it is interesting because in the beginning they were both very, very influential in how literature was, at least the new literature, was being written. So this essay, People's Literature,
人的文学,
yeah, is, we've used the word influential quite a bit, but it is very influential. It is the first, or one of the first, to take very, very seriously a new concept of what it means to be ren, to be a human being, a person. And the essay is essentially that. It's talking about how people are evolved. The entire human species is that which has evolved upwards from animals. And so he sort of takes that as a starting point. Okay, so we're evolved up from animals. So the goal is for us to continue to evolve. And he uses literature in this essay as that which will continue to help people evolve, grow, change.
When you say evolve, you're talking about like Darwin, evolution.
Yeah. And at the time, this had become sort of almost popular knowledge, Darwinian evolution. Andrew Jones has a book called Developmental Fairy Tales that's all about this, about evolution not just being a scientific concept, but actively being brought into popular entertainment. So that by the time he wrote this essay, this would not have been a revolutionary concept, but the idea that literature was a vehicle to further the evolution of the human species, that was a little different.
It's weird because one of the things, so the essay is called, like we said, People's Literature, or Literature of the People. But what he's doing, it seems to be taking the people out of literature, because his argument is essentially like all of that stuff that was considered literature before. So we've done a podcast on the Shioji, the Journey to the West. That's not literature.
Right.
Because it's not serious, and therefore it doesn't take people seriously. And therefore it's not people's literature or literature.
Yeah, for Joel Zorin, it's not people's literature unless the writing exists simply to explain and explore people, like self-consciously do so. So if you read Journey to the West and you go, there's a lot of interesting stuff here that we can learn about human beings. For Joel Zorin, that would be tangential. Right, you're getting that out of it, but when it was written, it was just written for fun.
But that seems really like a strange line to draw in the sand, right? Why does it matter what it was written for, and how can we divine what the author is writing for? I just find, so I should say Joel Zorin is writing this, he's making this argument that only serious literature qualifies
self-consciously serious.
Self-consciously serious literature qualifies as literature.
Right.
And that's a very common perspective during the May 4th.
Yeah.
I find it bumpkus.
How surprising.
I know. I'm not a May 4th.
There's a lot. I enjoy May 4th literature, but by no means do I think it's the only real quote-unquote literature. What we have to remember about this essay, though, is that this entire generation of writers is responding to something that was immensely problematic, which is how come we have these thousands of years of history, and yet from roughly 1849 on, we've been the doormat to the rest of the world. And in the beginning stages, the idea was, these other Western powers, and then eventually Japan, they have way better technology, so we'll just import the technology. Then that didn't work, and they lost to Japan in the Sino-Japanese War,
1895 to 1896.
And then they went, okay, then there's got to be something with us, like the way we think and write and do stuff. So we'll bring in other cultural writings and things and change that. And then it reaches its head in the May 4th movement in 1919.
And this is written in 1918, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so it's written at a point when scholars have basically had it with some scholars, this branch of guys, have had it with any notion that we can recoup something from the older ways of learning and sort of adapt to the modern world. For them, we're in this position because we've listened to the old stuff way too long. We're done. And so Joel Zorin is using this concept of evolution to suggest a way out of it.
I guess, for me, one of the issues I have with that... So I find... I'm sympathetic to part of Joel Zorin's argument in that he's saying the way that we did things, it ain't working.
Right.
I get that. And I think that's probably correct. But the solution that he has is, let's get rid of all of our old literature. That seems kind of bunk.
Well, he doesn't necessarily say all. He gives a sampling of a bunch of stuff that he thinks should not necessarily be gotten rid of, but it should not be considered important. And, you can read it just to dork around and have fun, but it shouldn't be seen as people's literature.
But even then, you can't really read it to dork around because you have to be thinking about evolving. We all have to constantly be thinking about evolving. And this is coming out of this very kind of racialized nationalistic discourse that's going on in China, where they're saying, hey, if our race, if the yellow race, if the Chinese race does not evolve, we will be
will be destroyed.
Yeah, we will become extinct.
Weeded out. We're looking at natural selection. We'll be selected out.
Right. But, I mean, I guess, first off, coming from a guy who does the Chinese literature podcast co-hosting, is literature that important? And second, I don't think that you have to write about serious stuff for it to be pushing us forward. You can write about stuff that's not serious. And, I mean, he's very... essentially, the way Zhou Zuoren structures his argument is that he's saying, well, this is what the West has been doing. You know, the West first started talking about people in the Renaissance and the Protestant Reformation. In the second period they talked about it was during the French Revolution. And he kind of says that, but he doesn't really give any literary examples from those periods.
He does talk about Ibsen.
He does talk about Ibsen, and he talks about, I mean, the main authors that he talks about are Ibsen and Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky, of course, he's maybe the most boring writer to come out of.
Oh my goodness!
Oh my goodness! We're gonna have a fight.
And Tolstoy's even better, but you probably
Tolstoy is amazing, but Tolstoy is also entertaining. Dostoevsky is not.
See, but this is a fun. I feel like we're almost in a tangential conversation here because Tolstoy is fun. I don't know that I've ever heard Tolstoy is fun. And if
I think he's amazingly entertaining.
I love Tolstoy, and I've read Anna Karenina multiple times, but I would not say bring this novel with me on a bus and be like, hey, you've read this book, you're going to love it. It's a lot of fun.
I actually do that.
You bring Anna Karenina on the bus and try to hawk it as popular, fun literature.
Absolutely. I've done that before.
I'm sure that failed miserably.
It worked out okay.
I think the point I was getting at just a second ago, though, was that you seem to be thinking about these writers these guys are accessing because of the maybe enjoyment factor or some notion of aesthetic value. And yet, based on the tone of the essay, what Zhou Zuoren is seeing is these writers' association with a specific line of reasoning that he sees as having made these other nations powerful. So the major literature in the 19th century... Go ahead.
I just want to point this out. He sees these kinds of literature as having made these nations powerful. So Ibsen has made Norway the superpower in 1918. There is no one more powerful than Norway. Okay, false. Right. Russia, with Dostoevsky, 1918, how were they doing? What was their kind of like state? Like his argument...
Well, he's writing after the Bolshevik Revolution, though.
Yeah, but they didn't do anything. They lost World War I, arguably, and they're just kind of like collapsing into revolution.
I think, though, the way a writer from this era might see it is, yes, but they're competing. China has done what?
I'm sorry, is Norway competing in 1918?
They're a part of Europe. I'm going. You're looking at it as what we know about it now, base versus how they're seeing it. We're not looking at guys who have.
I'm thinking about it from a 1918 perspective. I don't think anybody was going like, Russia is taking over the world now.
No.
Norway is taking over the world now. They're not powerful.
No, but people are taking them seriously. And
because of Ibsen and because of...
Well, that would be their... We can debate that whether we agree with it or not. I'm sort of situating this first because this is the way they're seeing it, is that these countries are taken seriously because of their culture, and one aspect of their culture is the literature. Because China's already tried to import technology wholesale, and that didn't work. And so they're seeing this as, okay, well, we need to do something about this, and here's what we do.
I guess I just don't see people taking some countries seriously because they have serious literature, and other countries not seriously because they don't have serious literature.
But that would be the Chinese... That would be the May 4th... One of the May 4th arguments is that we have this long classical tradition. Who reads it?
Well, I mean, it's not that... I don't think he's arguing that they have this long classical tradition. I think he's arguing against kind of earlier vernacular literature, and this is the problem that I'm getting at. He's arguing that Chinese traditional vernacular literature, so stuff that people liked, stuff that people read and enjoyed, that's the problem. Mm-hmm. And you just need to cut out this fun stuff and have literature be all serious-y, and then the nation will be improved. But I guess, I mean, one problem that I have with him is that this cuts out any notion of aesthetics. There's no discussion, really, of literature as art. It's literature as a tool.
No, I think you're right. I think he is seeing literature as, if not a tool, then at least something socially formative. And that's not an uncommon view. But one of the things I find intriguing about his point of view is that they're looking at as short a term solution as they can find, and they're looking at the most dramatic solution they can find, which for them was overhauling the culture. Now, and we should point out, this is the dominant narrative, really. If you study the era, everybody focuses very hard on the May 4th. But there's a lot of writing coming out of this era. The classical tradition never goes away.
Yeah.
There's a self-conscious promotion of, say, realism, but people are still writing classical stuff all through the era.
And this is a response to people who know the classical literature very well.
And not to play devil's advocate, but just to remind us, Joel Doran is being heavily influenced by a dominant theme in European Enlightenment, which structured many, many things on the European continent, which is that, at least in the 19th century, going into the late 19th century, science is the way, the truth and the light. And anything rooted in science is modern, true, and empirical, and everything else is dark and superstitious, which is one of the things that leads to...
He actually mentions dark and superstitious literature as one of the problems.
Right. And so he is in turn feeding off of one of the dominant narratives in Europe at the time. So he's not just dreaming up this idea of, hey, let's just write serious literature. One of the dominant discourses in Europe is on the importance of science grounding everything we do. To the point where, I don't know if have you read In Memoriam by Tennyson?
Yeah, of course.
So one of the things that Tennyson writes about a lot in there, the subject of a lot of poems is his anxiety. He's got a poem about his grieving over this friend who's died and thinking, well, but, if there really is no life after death, does that mean, because science says there's not, is my friend just gone forever? Like, there's this agony over what happens now. Like, we don't even know what's happening now because it's become the dominant mode of understanding.
I guess for me, part of the problem with this essay and all May 4th literature is that it's just so darn boring.
See, this is funny coming from the guy who's like, Tolstoy is so much fun.
He is fun. He's amazing. He's incredibly entertaining.
You know how many people I've heard say Tolstoy's boring?
And Zhang Ailing is incredibly entertaining as a writer. She's writing for the pleasure of readers. It's about aesthetics. She writes well. She writes beautifully, as does Tolstoy. It's a pleasure to hear his words come over my tongue.
See, but again, we're getting into sort of the wonderfully subjective, what is literature argument.
That's what we're discussing. This essay is about what is literature, what qualifies as literature.
But the thing is, like, I really enjoy a lot of May 4th literature. I enjoy reading Lu Xun.
And this is why we are not friends.
That's it. This is it. The Chinese Literature Podcast is going to go its separate ways after this episode.
But this is the May 4th argument. All May 4th literature is essentially presenting itself as this kind of very serious, almost like a pastor getting up to preach a sermon.
Well, it is, but I should point out that this is sort of the pretense of all realist literature. This is the pretense of Flaubert, for example, is that Flaubert is saying, I'm just putting onto paper how things happen.
But he never does that.
And that's what he says he does.
Yeah.
So we're dealing with what they're saying they're doing.
And I guess people like Flaubert and Lu Xun, who I like Flaubert. I don't like Lu Xun, although every time I have someone who's interesting explain Lu Xun to me, I like him more and more. But still, like, this realism thing doesn't do it for me.
So realism doesn't do it for you, but Tolstoy does. And Tolstoy's like the ultimate realist.
I don't know about that.
He is, if you read anything about realism, he is like one of the patron saints of realism. But the point is simply, what I would say about that, though, is that it is possible to do this kind of self-consciously, I'm going to write the way things are literature well, and then not so well. So in the the sort of realist camp in China, you have someone like Mao Dun, who's horrifically
Oh my
boring.
goodness, we should do a podcast on
We
him.
really shouldn't.
Just for
Guy's
the
boring.
listener who needs sleep.
So boring. And yet, here's what's funny, though, because Lu Xun always gets held up as this sort of paragon of realism and vernacularity and all that. And if you ever really read the whole collection of Warcry and think about it, it's way too weird and dark and resistant to be anything like that.
And Ye Cao,
Yecao's even more so.
his third published work, right?
Yeah, I think so. Well, he has published in maybe a book form.
Book
but,
form, yeah, sorry. It's incredibly weird and incredibly dreamlike. So again, I think my point is that I like Lu Xun in as much as he's not doing Chinese realism, in as much as he's not doing what Zhou Zuoren tells him, hey, you ought to do this.
Well, again, though, and this is one of the hard parts about this essay, if you ever do read it, dear listeners.
Which
is
we're
that-
going to put it on.
Can we put it up?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll put something up. Or put a link to it or something. Anyway, one of the tricky things about it is that he doesn't offer an antidote. He doesn't say, okay, I've told you people's literature is that which deals with the species and pushes us forward and is serious and all that. And here's some examples. Here's what he gives us Ibsen and maybe one or two others, but he doesn't give any kind of program or platform. It's just, so let's all just go out and do this. Well, that's open to a lot of interpretation. So by that sort of rubric, Lu Xun is very realist because he takes people, quote unquote, seriously. He's not just writing for fun. Then you have people like Mao Dun, who says he's doing the same thing, but kills it, and you don't want to read it.
And that's my problem with this. Mao Dun is the end result of Zhou Zuoren's Ren de Wenshui. It's the end result of Zhou Zuoren's people's literature. That's the problem.
So I'm guessing it's really subtle, but I'm getting from this that you're really not a fan of this essay. It's hard to pick up. The tone's very subtle.
I know. I'm sometimes unclear on when I have an opinion. I sometimes try and hide it.
I gotta really try to
keep it under the
drag
bushel.
out of you.
I keep it
is.
under the bushel.
Yeah, you really do. I find parts of it interesting. I find the idea of literature. I don't agree with it, but the idea that literature is supposed to be that which enables evolution is a weird idea and very interesting and very illustrative of the kinds of things that are happening in this era. Because you are looking at a discussion in which people are going, look, we're about to get selected out unless we do something. What is that? Well, not military, because we're getting our butts kicked. We have these thousands of years of other things, and clearly that's not helping. So what do? We have to throw the baby and the bathwater and everything else out and start over.
That's what he does. He throws the
trying
baby
to do
out
that.
with the bathwater.
Yeah. But that's one of the both interesting and destructive aspects of these suggestions. And yeah, I mean, I'm not going to read this essay as, man, everyone's got to read this because this is the way things should be. But it is a very interesting window onto what's being discussed here in this era.
So the listener should read this essay not because it's enjoyable or not because it informs our understanding of what literature is, but because it informs our understanding of how the May 4th movement is thinking about literature, and it explains to us why May 4th literature is so flippin' boring.
You keep saying May 4th. This is like your thing about theory. Theory is crap, he says, as he uses some theory in his own works because that's not crap. But the idea that...
My theory is not theory.
Your theory is that's truth. The theory is
just
used
truth.
Theory. It's just truth. But
he says humbly.
Yeah, so humbly.
Also, did you hear? I recently awarded myself Humblest Person in the Universe award.
Yeah, I hope there's a badge that goes with that so you can wear it around and show people. The idea that this essay is May 4th literature, I find incredibly problematic.
I don't think it's May 4th literature.
Or that it sets the platform for it.
I think it does, though.
I don't think it does. I think this is one idea of it. Well, this is because this
Breaking
is
up, Rob. I want a divorce.
That's it. We'll have new podcasts coming up soon. Mine's going to be way better, but no. But like when we think about what qualifies as quote unquote May 4th literature is all over the map. And when we think of something realist literature, you've got someone like Tolstoy, but then we've also got Flaubert, and each of those people has a scientifically derived platform not dissimilar from this. They're not necessarily talking about evolution, but they're saying if it's going to be literature, it has to be as scientific as possible.
I guess I would push back on Flaubert being... I mean, he may be realist.
But I want to say that's what he's saying about himself.
Right. But I mean, the sort of Flaubertian move is... Flaubertian move?
I don't know how to say that.
Yeah. Flaubertian move. We'll go with that.
Yeah.
Flaubertian move is that, it's le mot juste, right? Like the right word, the perfect word. So he is still concerned with aesthetics.
Yeah, but perfect word for what?
But it's perfect word. No, it's an aesthetic thing. It's an aesthetic category.
Yes and no.
He's concerned about getting the word, the right word for the reader. That's my understanding.
Yes, but is it the right word for the reader because it's the one that is the most striking and aesthetically pleasing? Or is it the right word because it communicates precisely the concept he's trying to communicate?
I assume the latter, but
Okay.
So
now we're not necessarily in the realm of aesthetics. We're more about... Well, I hate using a word as broad as scientific, but that's sort of his approach.
Fair enough. But I think he does it much better.
I would agree. You're going to get no contest from me about who was the better writer, Jules Oren or Flaubert. That's an easy one.
Let me ask you something. Flaubert versus Lucian.
I would say Flaubert.
Okay, good.
But
we're still in the same...
But it would depend also what we're comparing.
And
like if we're comparing an absolute masterwork by Flaubert versus Lucian, Flaubert. But if we're comparing, say, War Cry or Wild Grass, I don't know. That's a trickier comparison for me.
And they're such different writers.
They're very different writers, yeah. So we've wandered kind of all over the map here.
But I've enjoyed it.
It's been enjoyable. And I'll just finish my comments by saying I agree with you in the extent that this is a really interesting thing to read to get a window onto what was one of the animating ideas in May 4th literature. Not all May 4th literature, but this is something they're taking seriously, is what do we do with the tradition that we have? How do we move forward as a people with or without this? And ultimately, I think you see as many exceptions to it as examples in the May 4th era. I mean, Lucian himself, you can find exceptions all through his writing, and yet he was someone who was both related to Jules Oren and took this stuff very seriously.
I think that's a great place to end it.
Okay.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.